Chris, good afternoon. Thank you for joining me.
Pleasure, Richard. Look forward to our interview. Yeah.
Well, I thought I might start with a brief reprise of what I've called part one, because I'm sure there will be people that look at this and will have looked at the first version, but goodness, there may be people that didn't look at the first version. So this is part two of a conversation, because we left so much still to cover. So thank you for your time in doing this. And I Googled Christopher Herbert. Indeed, I Googled Chris Herbert because I thought I had better update myself. And I obviously didn't cover in the first conversation we had the fact that you were in entertainment management and responsible for finding the Spice Girls. I didn't cover that. Are you aware that if you Google Chris Herbert, that's what comes up?
No, Richard, I'm not at all. However, no, that's not me. But I have met Posh Spice.
Well,
here we are.
I'm glad you didn't tell me, otherwise I might have gone down a completely different line of conversation.
Well, when I was Bishop of St Albans, David Beckham and Victoria lived in the diocese, and I was invited across to meet them. So there we are.
There's a link, a segue.
Yeah, there's a link.
However, when I did Google Bishop Christopher Herbert, up you came. And a quick reprise, you were vicar at St Thomas on the Bourne from 1981 to 1990, then moved on to Archdeacon in Dorking, I think 1990 to 1995.
Correct.
And then appointed Bishop of St Albans from 1995 to 2009. And I think where we reached in our first conversation took us up to the end of 2009 and your retirement. And of course, you were in the House of Lords from 1999 to 2009.
Correct.
10 years. Now, I did have a couple of comments, and I'm going to start with these questions that I was asked from people that actually saw our conversation. And they're fairly tricky. The first one, what actually is a canon? Because I think you were a canon of Guildford Cathedral.
Yeah, I was. Great honour. And I was also, before that, when I was in Hereford, a prebendary of Hereford Cathedral.
I couldn't spell that, so I didn't write my notes.
And I say that because it's all to do with the history of cathedrals. And the canon, there are two kinds of canons in cathedrals. There are the residentiary canons. They live there, they work there, they do all of that. Take services, responsible for the fabric of the place, responsible for education. And then there are honorary canons, of whom I was one. And that's given to you as an honor by the diocese for work you have been doing or have done. And that was in recognition. I think I was in charge, as well as being vicar of the Bourne, which I absolutely loved. That was for being in charge of what we then called post-ordination training, in-service training of young clergy. That was what that went with. And when I was in Hereford, a prebendary, a prebend is a bit of land that originally paid for you to be a resident at the cathedral. So my prebend was called Morton et Wadden. I've no idea where those places were, no idea at all. But that, again, was an honour, just as in Guildford Cathedral, so in Hereford Cathedral. A title was given you either for long service or for a specific task. And because there I was the diocesan director of education, then I was given the title prebendary. But basically, on the whole, it's a sign, it's an honorary sign of your, I don't know, you can't use a word other than status, so I might as well use it, of your status in the diocese.
Well, I had a particular interest in following up this question because I have a relative who was an honorary canon of Southwark Cathedral. And maybe that's not a formal conversation like we're having being recorded, but when I next see you, I might ask you about that.
Okay.
And that was, he gave great service in this area of Southwark and Peckham.
Sure.
But another question, what's an archdeacon?
Well, the jokey response is the archdeacon is that crook at the head of the bishop's staff. You've got to, you have to put that out for a bit. Technically, the archdeacon is the eyes and ears of the bishop. So the bishop was my boss. When I was an archdeacon, it was the Bishop of Guildford, firstly Michael Adey, and then when he retired, it was John Gladwin. And the archdeacon's job is to be responsible for several things. Firstly, the appointment of all church wardens, because archdeacons in law hold courts of law. So when a church warden is sworn in as a church warden, it's actually in English law a court. So the archdeacon is responsible for all legal matters within the diocese. It's his job to obviously work closely with real lawyers as opposed to somebody who just mugged the job up. So the archdeacon is also responsible for personnel under the bishop. So the bishop might say, I've got a problem in parish X, can you go and sort it out? Might be to do with the vicar or relationships. So you are essentially the bishop's right-hand man for solving problems in the diocese. And you were also, I was heavily involved in all the committee work. And I counted up once, both if I added together all my national committees and my diocesan committees, the 5 years I was an archdeacon, I was on 40 committees.
Goodness me.
Yeah. Everything from the Bishop's Council through the Board of Finance, through the Diocesan Advisory Committee, which looks at buildings and so on. And the archdeacon has a responsibility to the bishop for all church buildings, vicarages and churches throughout the diocese. That, to be honest, I had no training in that at all, but I enjoyed it very much. I learned a lot from the architects that I wandered around with. Yeah.
Did that help with your interest in history and buildings and art and abbeys? That sounds a good fit.
It was a good fit. It really was, Richard, because I've always enjoyed buildings, but I don't, and how do I put it? I envy architects long before computer-aided design. I remember talking with an architect friend and saying what I envied about him was his capacity to draw a house, window, like a child would. And I can do that. But I couldn't envisage what it was like inside. Whereas he would do window, door in the center, and then say, and just inside that door, you'll see on your left and on your right, and you go upstairs. I couldn't do that in my head. I don't know why, but I couldn't, or didn't have the training. But I've always loved buildings, and I was lucky enough in my theological college to train at Wells.
Yeah, lovely.
Wonderful. And I had one of the jobs there was to be the sacristan, that is in charge of the vestry in the cathedral. And I had a key all my own to Wells Cathedral. So I could let myself into Wells Cathedral absolutely on my own, first thing in the morning, 6:30, nobody about, lock the door behind me and have that building to myself. Oh, bliss. Yeah. So, sorry.
No, absolutely. Well, I think, these, let me call them job titles, these positions, which we see, canon, archdeacon, aren't very well known in terms of what the roles are. And I think people, when they ask those questions, it put in mind for me, I'll ask you.
Yeah, sure.
Let's move to 2009 and retiring as Bishop of St. Albans, and your move into retirement. Now, you've got plenty of interests, and no doubt we'll come to those, but did you have a particular plan for your retirement?
I did actually, Richard. It may sound odd, but my plan was, first of all, to have between 3 and 6 months complete rest, do nothing. And I achieved that. Then I said, as far as church things go, I said to some of the local clergy, just leave me alone for a bit. I'm too tired to even think about taking services. And they were wonderful. They let me alone. And I would go to church quietly at an 8 o'clock service, kneel and say my prayers to everybody else. And after 6 months, that was fine. I would then help out wherever, as I still do. But I also wanted to develop some bits that I had to put a bit on the back burner. I was a bishop. So I wanted to develop my interest in art history.
Yeah.
And that developed. And then I wanted, I don't know how, well, I remember how it came about. I'd become interested in medical ethics in the House of Lords. And I was at I'd given a talk on the ethics of euthanasia in a church in this diocese. And somebody was sitting at the back of the church who afterwards said, why don't we have a coffee? I work at Surrey University, blah, blah, blah. And that ended up with me becoming a visiting professor at the university in the ethics field, which I enjoyed very much. It was a great honor. I didn't expect to do that. So art history was going to be my thing when I retired. And so then became art history and ethics. And now more recently, it's become art history, ethics, and local history. Yeah. So that, but I think everybody, honestly, Richard, I think everybody before they retire has to make a decision. What are you going to do? It's no good saying, well, I'll do a bit of gardening, because that won't take up any time. You have to be, an American friend of mine used to say, Christopher, you're very intentional. Well, yeah, you know, it's the way, if you don't do that, you just drift around a golf course, don't you?
Well, yeah, drift. Yeah, I spend a lot of time searching on a golf course.
Do you?
But I ask you about a plan because your interests that come through, you've mentioned art, you've mentioned art history, writing. You've got an extensive list of publications, and we'll come to more recent writing in a moment. Your lectures, extensive range of lectures.
Yeah.
But I'd like to, and ethics, I want to come back to ethics, if I may, given the, and without getting into any politics, but given what's going on in time at the moment. But what about these art gallery visits? Because you started to host, in your interest of art and art history, gallery visits to various London art galleries.
Yeah. That was an idea I had that I thought would be a good thing to do. And I had a colleague who was an art historian as well, and she was retiring, and she said, why don't we, do some art gallery visits? Well, a few came off, but they faded away after a bit. But I was asked by the Archbishop, then Rowan Williams, if I would do in-service training for bishops on art history. So I would take groups of bishops around art galleries in London, introducing, I'd go to the Guildhall, I'd go to the National Gallery, go to the Tate and so on. And that was just a way of trying to broaden people's perception of things. And then parishes that I'd known said, oh, can you take us to the National Gallery? So I did that for a while. And then came COVID, so that's all ceased. But if anybody watching this wants me to take a group to the National Gallery, very happy to do it.
Excellent.
The whole I don't do it these days.
All right. In terms of visiting those galleries, and I was drawn to this area of your interest because Farnham is a craft town. Farnham hosts the UCA. We've currently got, Surrey Open Artists Studio, and there seems to be dozens of locations now with that. So I thought I'd focus on art. But what's your favourite gallery and why?
Gosh, Richard.
Well, I'll tell you mine.
Go on.
Get you started. I love the National Portrait Gallery, albeit it's under refurbishment at the moment, because it brings to life various dimensions: people, art, place, history, politics. Sure. So I love it for that reason. So how about you?
I've got three, I think, Richard. I love the National Gallery, but I concentrate, because of my interest in the Sainsbury wing, on 15th century Northern European art, because that's my profoundest love. That's artists like Jan van Eyck and Hans Memling and people like that. So I do mostly Northern European art when I take groups around, Piero della Francesca. Then I've not been there, I've been there about 3 times. The Thyssen-Bornemisza Gallery in Madrid.
Mm.
And why do I like that? Because it's quite small, and you start at the top, well, used to start, I haven't been for some years now, used to start at the top of that, walk down. It was so designed that you walk through the history of art, just going down and down and down. Wonderful. And there was a particular painting in there that really gripped me. It was a painting of the resurrection of Christ. And I don't know why, it was just so powerful. And I've always kept an image of that. And then recently, in fact, only a couple of weeks ago, I went with some friends to Pallant House Gallery in Chichester. Hmm. Now, that's a lovely, lovely gallery. I'm not too enamored of modern British art, but there was an absolutely stunning exhibition there of an artist I'd never heard of called Glyn Philpott. Absolutely brilliant. And he was an artist working in the first half of the 20th century. Wonderful portraiture, especially of Black men. Absolutely stunning. And it was like an epiphany when you come across an artist you've never, ever heard of. And he used to be apparently very famous, but he went out of fashion and galleries didn't keep his work anymore. My gosh, he worked in bronzes and all the rest of it. And then not so much a gallery, but things in galleries. I love Jacob Epstein's Jacob Wrestling with the Angel in the Tate. Stunning, stunning, great block of alabaster. And I go and walk around that, just go occasionally. I don't know about you, Richard, but I can't cope when I say I like the National Gallery. I have to say I'm just concentrated on that. I started as a teenager, you know, wandering around thinking I've got to absorb it all. And you just can't. Too exhausting. You've got to decide on the period you're really interested in and get to know it and go back and get to know it again. Yeah.
I'd like to move you. You've mentioned Spain, from Spain to Italy.
Yeah.
Because Italy seems to me to, I'm going to use the word meld or maybe merge two of your interests into one.
Yeah.
Art and history, which becomes history through the art.
Yeah.
How important to you is Italy in your interests?
Oh, Richard, I can't, I mean, like many English people, I just absolutely love Italy. I don't know why I said this in the previous interview, but I'm actually an honorary citizen city in Italy, a place called Fano. Why do I love Italy? The people, climate, food, and of course, every church you go into, you know, just stops you in your tracks. And I remember going there once. I used to take pilgrimages to Ravenna and Pesaro and Urbino. And I was once on a pilgrimage and was taken to see a tiny, tiny museum of the Apennines, which had some gilded, I suppose you'd call it, horses that had been found in a field. Absolutely wonderful. So I love Italy. We, like everybody else, we haven't been able to go back there. We've got lots of friends down the Adriatic. And I spent time in Italy, only briefly, inside of a week in a monastery there, which is gorgeous. So that combination of the light, the people, the food, the coffee, the wine, the ambience, and the art. I mean, what could be lovelier?
Well, I wondered if you were going to get around to mentioning the wine, and I was hesitant about whether I should mention it, but I couldn't imagine a bishop not having a view about Italian wine.
Yes. Well, I do, Richard, for two reasons. Firstly, because communion wine is called vino sacro. I don't recommend it for more than the faintest sip. But I actually make a point, as far as possible, I mean, I enjoy Burgundy, of course, but I try from time to time to buy Italian wine in the hope that some Italian vineyard somewhere might gain a bit by me having bought some of their bottles of wine. I'm not an expert on Italian wine. I just enjoy, on the whole, I enjoy red wines from Burgundy and Italy. Yeah. And the occasional Rioja.
Well, the reason I mention it is not for the obvious reason, but there's something about wine and its terroir which talks to you about place and environment and culture, isn't it? But let me move on a bit, because lectures have been another feature of your time.
Yeah.
Now, I'm bound to say you do like a good title. Now, some of your lectures, I need to find my notes on this. Here we are. Blood, Roses and Elephants.
Yeah.
Oh, you've mentioned Burgundy. Banks, Burgundy and Piracy.
Yeah.
Eccentrics, Detectives and Dog Collars. Now, somewhere in the mix of those titles is a story about Christopher Herbert.
Yeah.
Blood, Roses and Elephants and Albans.
Yeah.
Banks, Burgundy and Piracy. The Artists of Bruges. And I'd like to ask you about Bruges.
Yeah.
And then Eccentrics, Detectives and Dog Collars, which maybe has started to get you thinking about becoming a novelist. But let's go to Bruges first. Bruges is almost unique, isn't it, as a place?
Oh, it's utterly wonderful. And I don't know where to start, really. I've taken groups to Bruges, but I mean, the late 15th century in Bruges was the art and capital of the entire universe at that stage. I know the Italians will disagree with that, but in Northern Europe, it was absolutely the tops for several reasons. Firstly, there was a very, very wealthy clientele. The Dukes of Burgundy had one of their main headquarters in Bruges. And the Dukes of Burgundy, the territory of the Dukes of Burgundy was like a nation state. It stretched from the Dutch-Belgian coast, what is now the Dutch-Belgian coast, right down into Burgundy and beyond. So a kind of great corridor. So where you've got wealth, you've usually got art, because artists need to survive and they need patrons. At the same time, if you've got wealthy people and you've got artists, and in Bruges' case, you've got the whole textile industry, then you have entrepreneurs and merchants, and therefore you have banks. So in Bruges, in the late 15th century, you've got several Italian banks, including the Medici Bank. By the way, the Medicis had a sub-branch in London, a sub-branch, not the main branch in Bruges. London was a sub-branch. So that combination of wealth, princes, artists, and technology, because two things were going on in Bruges. Firstly, there was the kind of development of oil painting. So that was a new technique which the Italians in the Renaissance had not yet discovered. They learnt their oil painting techniques largely from Northern European artists. And at the same time, you'd got the technology, not only of the paint itself, but of the brushes. Bruges was the center of the fur trade. So you could get very, very fine brushes. You know, go down to the local market and buy a nice paintbrush. I exaggerate slightly, but only slightly. So the combination of those things coming together with some absolute masters of art, I just find it fascinating, not least because from a theological point of view, their paintings are very rich in symbolism, deep symbolism. So yeah, I love Bruges.
Yeah, it's a great place. I've enjoyed various visits there myself. Yeah. Another feature that comes through your retirement period, apart from it being busy and full of indulging your interests in a magnificent way, is writing. But before writing comes this interest in abbeys. You call, your website's The Three Abbeys.
Yeah.
Is this about that particular period of history. You've mentioned, the 16th century, 15th century, 16th century, obviously, predominantly abbeys before Henry VIII. What's your interest particularly in abbeys, and 3 abbeys in particular, I think you list?
Yeah, I did. Why 3? Well, as a child, I grew up near Tintern Abbey on the banks of the River Wye. And although I wouldn't have been able to put it into words at the time, on the kind of yonks ago, as a child, my father would occasionally take us out for Sunday afternoon drives in the car, And Tintern was one of the places we frequently went past. We never visited it, but it was so beautiful. It just got me somehow. Then, of course, St. Albans Abbey, when I was bishop, that was just amazing. Amazing, amazing place. And then my wife is originally from Leeds, so Kirkstall Abbey.
Right.
3 abbeys are part of childhood, part of marriage, part of, and St. Albans, obviously. It should be 4 abbeys now because of Waverley, but to be honest, I didn't know much about Waverley. So those particular abbeys that had an attraction for me as architecture and as places that had once been great and that now just became ruins.
So one of your recent publications, talking of ruins, that's perhaps not the right way to put those 2 phrases together, is of course Waverley Abbey, the Abbey in the Winding Wood. Have I got the title right?
The Abbey in the Winding Meadow.
Yeah. And in a way, I often feel we don't make the most of this. This is really quite significant in the development of Christianity in England and in Britain more generally, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And of course, one of the reasons we don't is, whereas if you go to Tintern or Kirkstall, the Abbey ruins, you can read them, they're massive. So you can see what, you just sort of wander around and get a feel for what was going on there. St. Albans still in use, so you can now see an abbey absolutely humming with activity. But Waverley, because it was so robbed of its stone, which went over to Loseley House, whilst I've met a lot of people who say they just love the atmosphere there, you can't get the size and shape of the place unless you have a very powerful imagination, just from the few bits that are left. But historically, hugely important. First Cistercian Abbey in England, first. So, yeah.
Maybe we should ask the Lord Lieutenant whether we can have some of the stones back, Chris.
Sure. Be lovely.
Yeah, it raises that question of whether we make the most of the heritage, and in particular the history of Farnham. I know the Museum Society is fantastic, but all around us is history that speaks to stories and one thing and another. I mentioned Waverley. You've mentioned its place in the development, early development of Christianity in this country as the first Cistercian Abbey. But of course, you've then got Waverley Abbey House. And I was amazed to see that there's a link, strong link, between Florence Nightingale and Waverley Abbey House.
Absolutely.
I wonder how many people in general understand that there's a link to Farnham with Florence Nightingale.
Sure. That was the Nicholson family, to whom she was related.
Yeah.
And at one point, it even looked as though she might get engaged to one of the Nicholson boys, but she turned him down. But yeah, it's lovely to think she was there. So to go back to history of Farnham, Roy Waite, you will know, and others, but Roy especially, has done a fantastic job in increasing understanding of local history. Another person I must mention, Pam Taylor at the Museum Society. My gosh, she's a stalwart, keep living on, trying to raise the profile of history in Farnham. And there are others, people, Maurice Hewins over in Badshot and Hale, looking at First World War stuff. So there have been times in the history of Farnham when books are published about it. And to quote Pam Taylor, it appears to be a bit of a golden age at the moment in Farnham, with Roy writing and so on. But there were previous people like the Eubank Smiths doing Edwardian Farnham and so on. And smaller groups like the Bourne Conservation Group. Some of the stuff they've done, not just on ecology, but especially on the history of the Bourne, absolutely fascinating. So there are groups of people in Farnham who are really genuinely interested, which is why I think at the U3A, there is now a local history group, which Marie Wisby runs, and she's another key player in this history field, along with Pat Heather. I mean, you know, Pat Heather's publications, but she's written, I mean, absolutely amazing research on each individual house in the borough and in Downing Street. Just amazing. I mean, I can do that. Don't have the patience, but amazing.
But it is something to celebrate, isn't it? And take the opportunity when we're chatting like this to say, we are very lucky with people and personalities and stories and buildings in Farnham across the years, across the centuries, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I mentioned Florence Nightingale because I understand she gave a gift to the original Farnham Hospital, which she did, which I actually think is, would I be right in thinking it's a chalice or it's something? I mean, it's in Roy Waite's article.
Yeah.
And I think the original hospital was the Trimmers Hospital, or now what is Phyllis Tuckwell. And I wondered whether we knew where that item was.
I don't know. I think the original hospital was actually it was the workhouse down where the new hospital now is. That was the original hospital, which then transmogrified from which, as a workhouse, had an infirmary.
Yeah.
Grim. And that then transformed again under various public health acts to become Farnham Hospital. So that, I think, is the history. But the person you need to ask about that is Dr. Ian Wallace. Knows a great deal about the history of medicine in Farnham. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that suggestion. I mean, there's a rich opportunity in conversations, isn't there? But let me stick with your interests and your writing. You've written on education, you've written on, I'm looking at my notes, spirituality, health and ethics, and we'll come back to that, but also hymns and poetry. Yeah. And I was interested to read some of your poetry, A Room in Liverpool, Undiluted Joy, a wonderful poem, if I might say, about reflecting on the atmosphere of a courtyard in Italy.
Yeah.
How important to you is the rhythm of the word and the music in terms of hymns, that aspect of Bishop Christopher?
Oh, gosh. Well, where do I start? I'm going to go right back to my roots in the Forest of Dean, where, because of the local dialect, the language was very rich and very rhythmical. Because it was on the edge of Wales as well, you've got the Welsh influence. So I was brought up, I count myself hugely fortunate to have grown up in a place that was linguistically very, very rich, economically very poor, linguistically very rich. And that gave me my love of language. I was very fortunate, and 2 or 3 schoolmasters I had, they developed that. And I, by nature, I'd always loved writing. I mean, I think back to primary school days, the moment when the teacher hands out a sheet of paper and he's obviously bored to tears and so says, okay, I want you to write today about, I don't know, the life of a penny or the life of a bit of paper blowing on the street. I loved it. I don't know why, I just loved writing stories. And that has stayed with me. So I read voraciously still, all sorts. And so writing came, I don't say it came naturally. I loved using words and investigating the origins of words. And I think that comes from my geographical background. My wife, of course, was head of English at St. Catherine's at Bramley, so I have that I learned so much from her. And then most of my writing, if you sort of break it down into groups, the spirituality was largely written when I was here in the Bourne as the vicar. Because I wanted especially young people to realize they'd entered a rich linguistic heritage. So I wrote a little collection of prayers which is now called the Classic Collection. I didn't call it that, which has been in print now for, I don't know, 30, 40 years now.
Goodness.
That's a collection of about, I don't know, 50 prayers or so that I just wanted any young person just to look at and think, gosh, yes, that's an interesting way of expressing yourself or thinking about life. Then my educational work before that, my very first book was a dance drama that I wrote when I was a teacher in a secondary modern school in Hereford. And that was performed in Hereford Cathedral. So that was my first kind of, gosh, I can write a book that will be published. And it went on from there. And each phase in my life, I've found I've been able to use, I suppose, such skills as I have in writing. Then Robin Radley, when he was the editor of the Herald, asked me back in the 80s if I would write weekly, fortnightly pieces for the Herald, which I did for many years. And now Daniel has asked me again, which is lovely. So I enjoy that. Yeah.
Well, writing, as you bring it up, in that sense, in the way that you've always enjoyed it, is a nice link into your first, I think it's your first published novel.
Yeah.
Calling of, now is it Clemo or Clemo Trelawney?
Clemo.
Clemo Trelawney.
Yeah.
The Calling of Clemo Trelawney. Now,
yeah.
I'm going to ask you whether there's an element of biographical prompting in your development of this Calling of Clemo Trelawney, because it says that here was somebody who had to decide his future path in life. Was it going to be town or country?
Yeah.
Was it going to be, I'll use the word bishop, but monk or businessman?
Yeah.
And actually, there's a piece in there that says his family business included working in, I think, on the farm, but also in a foundry. And I remember in our first part of this conversation, your background also includes the foundry. So is there an element of biographical detail that comes through this novel?
I'm not aware of it, except the foundry is certainly real, and that is autobiographical, for two reasons. One, I think I said in my previous piece, my father had trained as an iron molder, and his uncle ran a foundry. So foundry and iron was, as it were, on the edges of conversation. Then I was taken when I was a sixth former to a tiny foundry in a place called Redbrook, just down the Y from Monmouth as you go to Chepstow. And the reason the geography master took us there, he said, I want you to see what will be the last remaining tin plate works in Northern Europe before it closes. And I was taken there, and I looked suitably bored being an adolescent, but actually it made a great impression on me, seeing those men hurling great slabs of tin, hot tin, across the floor. So that's why Redbrook Foundry came into my head. As far as the kind of vocational bit that this man has, I suppose I must inevitably have drawn on the question that everybody becomes a clergyman has to face in the end is this a calling, or what is it? What's going on? And you have to try and as possible. So I must have drawn on that. I have no other, I'm not aware of any other characteristics of mine that I would put with Clemo or Clemo with me. He's somebody out there, a different person from me. But I enjoyed,
Yeah. What about the process of writing? You've written a great deal. Was writing this fiction a different process for you than your previous writing?
Yes, utterly different, Richard. I'd always wanted to write a detective story, and I set out, not with Clemo, but some years back, I thought I'd like to write a detective story. So I wrote a detective story, and the trouble is, by the end of it, I didn't know who'd done it. It's a complete disaster. And I thought, oh, well, perhaps I should give up writing. But with Clemo, because of the research I'd done on Waverley Abbey, and the previous research on Farnham and the Reformation, that gave me the structure I needed to write a novel. So I didn't have to invent a structure, I didn't have to say who'd done it. I'd got that, the history provided the structure, and I could develop the characters. So that's why it happened. Why Clemo Trelawney? I was in lockdown. I don't know why. I was looking at Cornish connections at all, but I was looking at Cornish names on a Wiki website. Oh gosh, that's a nice name, Clemo. And it grew out of that. It was very simple, really. And then the strange thing is, Richard, which I'd heard novelists say, is that the characters develop a life of their own. And but when I started this, there were times, well, I didn't expect him to do that. Why have you done that? It's quite extraordinary.
Your writing has a dynamic of its own, as you know, as you translate from mind through pen to page.
Yes.
It can actually, go off, can't it? In different.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So, Clemo, is this volume 1? Is there going to be another?
Well, it's lovely to ask. So many people have said, are you going to do the next one? And I've put it off and put it off and put it off, because at the moment I'm just finishing a book for the Museum Society on Roman and Anglo-Saxon Farnham. And I want to get that out of my head and done and out there before I start thinking whether I do a sequel. Because writing a historical novel involves a huge amount of research. You can't just sit down and write it. Mm. You have to know the details of the places your hero goes to. You have to know the kind of food they ate. You have to know the clothes they wore. You have to do a lot of research. So if I write a sequel, I don't know whether I will or not yet, but if I do, I shall have to do it'll be a year or two of research before I put pen to paper. Yeah.
Well, as in our first part of this conversation, we could go on for much longer, but I will bring it to a close now by just referring to your role at the University of Surrey with ethics. And given, what we've heard in recent weeks about the resignation of the ethics advisor, do you think government needs an ethics advisor? I have in mind what you wrote in one of your pieces for the Herald recently, that we all have to do our own thinking about ethics.
Yeah.
Just very briefly, what's your view about that? Is it a real role?
I think it could be, and I think it has been. The danger of having an ethics advisor is that the cabinet, I'm not getting into party politics, the cabinet can shift their responsibilities over to somebody else and say, well, we'll run it past the ethics advisor, see what he says. Now that could be a good thing, but mostly I want the ethics done around that cabinet table. So I think you need an advisor, but somebody who is there as a last resort, but not to make the decisions for you. You ought to be thinking the whole time as politicians around the cabinet, what are the ethical consequences of what we're saying and doing? And I think the evidence we've had over the last few years, he says, being as careful as he can, that the kind of boisterousness and the love of power gets in the way of clarity of thinking. And therefore, ethical decisions have been pushed all over the place and they don't remain central on the cabinet table. That's where they should be. Very hard, fully accept that, because politics is the art of the possible and ethics on the whole moves towards absolutes. But real ethics gets stuck into the detail of what is possible, like politics.
Well, I think I was going to finish by saying, ex-member of the House of Lords, is this a possible new role for retired Bishop Christopher Herbert? But maybe I won't finish on that, Chris. I'll finish now by thanking you once again for a great conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And I'll probably end where I started and leave you to go back to the Spice Girls. Chris, thank you very much indeed.
Richard, thank you very much. It's lovely talking with you as always. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.